Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here to talk a few more favorites from 2024. So 2024 was an amazing reading year, and if you haven't already checked out my favorite fiction books of 2024, you can do so up here at this link. But today we're going to be talking nonfiction. In 2024, one of my biggest goals was to read more nonfiction. In the past years, I've read like, I don't know, 10 to 20 nonfiction books, and I usually enjoy them. I'm interested in a wide variety of subjects, and after hearing so many amazing recommendations for nonfiction and seeing so many great nonfiction lists, I decided I really wanted to make an effort to get closer to 20% of my reading for the year. I did hit that goal. I read over 40 nonfiction books in 2024, which I'm super excited about. Even more exciting is the fact that I read about a huge variety of subjects. One of the things that really propelled me in my nonfiction reading for 2024 was signing up for the BookTube prize. I ended up reading fiction in 2 rounds and nonfiction in 2 rounds, and so I was introduced to a whole bunch of really fantastic nonfiction reads. This was a joy participating in this, and actually you'll find quite a few of the books that I read for the BookTube prize ended up on my best nonfiction list here. So as I wrap up everything from 2024, one of the things that I often find hard is to compare fiction and nonfiction because it's just such a different narrative structure. Nonfiction for me is about conveying facts in a way that makes it interesting, makes a book readable, and teaches me something about the subject that I'm reading about. Whereas fiction, I'm looking for creativity, I'm looking for literary style, flow, a lot of different things. And so instead of trying to create 24 books of 2024 that's a mix of fiction and nonfiction, I think I want to just do a fiction list and a nonfiction list. So as you've probably seen, or maybe you haven't, I already have that fiction list up, and now today we're going to talk only nonfiction. All right, so let's get straight into this. I have 24 amazing nonfiction books all across a wide variety of genres. Hopefully, if you're looking for a great nonfiction read, you will find something that interests you here. Each of them is very compelling for different reasons. So number 24 on my list is The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder by David Grann. This was a book that came across my radar because I'd heard some rumblings about it on BookTube. I had seen some really good reviews of it, people just talking about what a fantastic and interesting read it was, but I actually didn't end up picking it up until the BookTube prize. This was one of the first nonfiction books that I had to read in one of the rounds that I was judging, and I was not sure if I was gonna like this or not. I do find like ships and travel and things like that interesting, and mutiny and murder and all of that, but sometimes the time period can affect how I feel about a book. This did end up being a really compelling read. David Grann is known for being a really good nonfiction author. Some of his other books are Lost City of Z and Killers of the Flower Moon. I know that one's pretty familiar right now because it was just made into a movie last year. So high expectations when you go into a book by David Grann. I think that for the most part, those expectations were met. Basically, in January of 1742, a ramshackle vessel made of driftwood and patched together pieces with a crew of 30 people who are all emaciated and starving shows up on the coast of Brazil. And these 30 men have a wild story to tell. They were all survivors of a British vessel called the Wager, and they had left Britain in 1740. The ship was doing a secret mission during an imperial war with Spain, and while the Wager had been chasing a Spanish galleon, they ended up wrecking. The men, after being marooned for months, starving, facing exposure, patched together this vessel and managed to make it to the coast of Brazil. These men were all hailed as heroes. That is, until another group of men made it to land, and then a twisty story came out. There were accusations of mutiny and anarchy flung back and forth between the two groups, and eventually court had to intervene to decide what happened. This is a fascinating read, really. If you like murder, if you like mutiny, if you like survival, politics, all of that, this has a little bit of something for everyone. And David Grann writes it in a way that makes it a very easy read. If you're dipping your toes into nonfiction for the first time, this is a great place to start. Number 23 on my list is Hijab Butch Blues by Lamia H. So this is a memoir, but it is written by an anonymous person. The person writing it is a queer hijabi Muslim, And she, around the age of 14, starts to come to terms with the fact that she may be a lesbian. And that causes her kind of some turmoil with her faith and the things that she has grown up to believe. Lamia initially finds comfort in Miriam's story within the Quran. Miriam is pregnant and swears up and down that she's been touched by no man. And Lamia starts to wonder if maybe Mariam had a similar identity to her and finds some solace in that. She also discusses the gender of Allah, who is neither he nor she, but God. And it's just a really interesting musing on identity and religion and the convergence of the two. I thought it was really well written, and as someone who's not at all religious, I thought that this was a very interesting exploration of what faith means to people and how people can come to terms with two conflicting ideologies. I thought that this was a really interesting read, and if you in particular like to explore gender identity and faith, this would be an interesting book for you. Number 22 was Floating in a Most Peculiar Way by Chude-Sokei. So this is a book that I found on my road trip across the southwest of the United States in a bookstore in Phoenix, Arizona called Changing Hands. This was such an interesting story. Like, when I read the summary of this book, I immediately picked it up. This story follows Lewis's life. He is the son of the leader of the Biafran Revolution in Nigeria, and he and his mother fled when he was very young. So he spent most of his life growing up in Jamaica and never really all the way fitting in because he is not Jamaican, he is Biafran. And then at a certain point in Lewis's life, his mother decides that they should move to Los Angeles, and she ends up in Inglewood. So Lewis is now in a third culture and doesn't quite fit there either because he's Jamaican and Biafran, and he really longs to just find a place where he actually fits and he can assimilate. He talks a lot about the struggles of being trapped between different cultures and not really knowing where he fits. He is reminded constantly that he is the son of this important person in Biafra, but he doesn't really have any personal connection to Biafra because he left when he was so young. He eventually talks about his process of returning home and getting to know a little bit of his father's legacy. This is a really interesting story, and it actually inspired me to do more reading about Biafra and Nigeria and that whole conflict. I really wasn't that aware of it or that knowledgeable of the subject before reading this book. I do not think that this is a perfect memoir. I think that at times it's a little bit disjointed, and I wish that Lewis went into a lot more detail specifically on the conflict and why him and his mother fled. But it is a really interesting memoir about immigration and what it takes for people to move from place to place and being stuck between different cultures. If you're really interested in immigration and cultural identity, I think that this would be a good memoir for you to read. Number 21 is Fierce Ambition, The Life and Legend of War Correspondent Maggie Higgins by Jennet Connant. Maggie Higgins catapulted herself to journalistic fame with her recounting of the liberation of Dachau concentration camp. Higgins was brash, beautiful, and ruthlessly competitive, but before she had made it to Dachau to report on the liberation, she was told frequently that battlefronts were no place for women. She was barred frequently by the social conventions of women in war zones at the time, but she refused to take no for an answer. She fought her way to the front lines, and she did some of the most meaningful reporting all the way from World War II through the Korean War, eventually winning herself a Pulitzer Prize. As with many successful women, she was often vilified. People said that she rose to the top on her back, essentially trading sexual favors for journalistic scoops. But this story delves into detail about who Maggie Higgins was and how she rose to journalistic fame. This was a book that I found through NetGalley. I was scanning through books that were available to request, and I was looking at stuff towards the end of 2023, and I ended up getting a e-copy of this book, and I ended up reading it at the beginning of 2024. I found this to be a fascinating read. Maggie Higgins was fierce and tough and just would not take no for an answer. It was fascinating learning about all of the hurdles that she had to overcome to make her journalistic career. It was also interesting hearing about how her role changed what journalism was for many other women coming up behind her. I thought that this read very smoothly. I was really engaged in it and really interested to learn more. And then when you consider the breadth of her career from World War II all the way through Korea, I thought this was just a fascinating read. If you're interested in badass women doing badass things, history, war reporting, journalism, anything like that, this is a book you should put on on your TBR. Editing Caitlin here because I realized as I was recording this video that I skipped number 20, which is Why Fathers Cry at Night by Kwame Alexander. So this was a nonfiction memoir, but it's a little bit different than some of the other memoirs that are on this list, and that is because it is told in short stories and recipes and poetry and like a whole bunch of different stuff. Kwame Alexander is a really interesting guy. I've read some of his books before, and you can just see he has such a creative mind, and that shows in his memoir and his way that he tells his story. I in particular was really interested in the recipes that he included. I loved that they were interspersed throughout the story and connected with some of his core memories. I also really appreciated the way that he talked about fatherhood and his relationship with children, and then also how he talked about the end of his marriage and divorce and realizing that this person that he loved for such a long time was just not going to be the person for forever. That's a hard realization to come to, and I thought that he was very relatable in that discussion and very frank, and I just really appreciated it. This wasn't necessarily the most perfect memoir. I think in some areas I wish that he could have gone a little bit deeper, but overall I thought this was really well done, and I especially again appreciated the creative format of it. So if you're interested in memoirs that reflect on the average day-to-day life in unique ways, if you like prosy writing, if you like memoirs that are told in short stories that include recipes and poems and lots of different forms of storytelling, then I would suggest checking this out. I found this to be a really enjoyable and worthwhile read. Number 19 was My Side of the River by Elizabeth Camarillo Gutierrez. When she's 15, her parents' visas expire and they are forced to return to Mexico. Elizabeth is old enough that she wants to stay and finish her high school career, and so she talks her parents into leaving her behind. She relies on teachers and other adults in her life to kind of patch things together and help her get through the remaining school years. But this is not an easy experience for her. She longs for the comfort of her parents. She's still really a bit too young to be on her own. The people that she should be able to rely on in these situations often fail her, and she just ends up in this really dark, frustrating place. This for me was a really touching memoir. I think that oftentimes when we talk about immigration in this country, it's very politicized, and people feel very strongly one way or the other about immigration. And I think that memoirs like this are really important because we have to remember that the people we're talking about are humans, and there are consequences for the immigration policies that we have in the United States. Families sometimes have to choose behind leaving a child behind so they can finish education, or taking them with and possibly changing their future trajectory. It is a difficult choice, and there are many kids that are affected by these situations. I grew up in a border city, and I had many friends that dealt with complicated immigration statuses for family members. So this is very much not a black and white issue, and I think stories like this really do a good job of humanizing this issue. If you're particularly interested in immigration, in stories of overcoming extreme obstacles, this would be a book that I would highly recommend. Number 18 on my list is The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church by L Swarns. So I feel like I have read a decent amount of nonfiction surrounding slavery in the United States and many of the impacts and the lasting repercussions to Black Americans. But this was a book that talked about this issue in a context that I was unfamiliar with. This talks specifically about how the Catholic Church in the United States exploited Black slaves to essentially fund projects, build Georgetown, and then lied and broke promises over and over again to specific families. On Juneteenth in 1838, a group of America's most prominent Jesuit priests sold 272 slaves to fund their most prominent project, which soon became Georgetown. This book ends up following one family through almost 2 centuries of indentured servitude and slavery. This book talks about the Mahoney family, starting with Anna Joyce, a free Black woman who sails to the United States. And she's here on a contract of indentured servitude, but when she arrives in the States, her contract is ripped up and she is sold into slavery. Her descendants are then enslaved by Jesuit priests, and the church eventually makes them promises that they will be freed, that they will not sell family members to different places, all of these things. And the church promptly breaks all of those promises in order to continue funding the construction of Georgetown. This book is maddening and frustrating and infuriating and rage-inducing, but I think it's super important to know this history. I think we do a disservice to the victims when we are unaware of the things that happened to them. And considering that this family, dealt with years and years and years of horror at the hands of the church, I think it's important that the story be told. I also think that it's fair that we know how the Catholic Church was built in the United States, and that is on the backs of slaves. Like I said, this was a book that delved into an aspect of slave history and Catholicism that I was frankly unaware of. I'm really glad that I read it. It wasn't an easy read by any means, but I think it is a really important one. If you're interested in the history of the United States, history of the Catholic Church, civil rights, slavery, anything like that, I think that this is a book that you should definitely pick up. Number 17 is Built from the Fire, the epic story of Tulsa's Greenwood District, America's Black Wall Street. This is by Viktor Luckerson, and this is another one of the books that I read for the BookTube Prize. So this is essentially the history of Tulsa's Greenwood District, which was colloquially known as Black Wall Street. So this book is the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is most commonly known for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. But there's so much more history than just that one isolated event. In particular, the Greenwood District of Tulsa was a place of Black innovation, Black business, and a lot of Black history. I myself didn't really know much about Tulsa aside from the race massacre and race riots, and this goes into just this expansive history that I was completely unaware of. I found this really interesting, really well written, full of a lot of information and detail that really fleshed out this story of this city. This talks about the beginning of Tulsa, how the Greenwood District came to be, and how eventually the race massacre, where almost 300 people were killed, happened. And then it talks about afterwards and how the Greenwood District was rebuilt and how families stayed and what happened to Tulsa in the end. I found this to be a fascinating book, and in particular, I feel like this filled in a lot of gaps of knowledge around Tulsa and the things that occurred there. Even in terms of my understanding of the Tulsa Race Massacre, I think that it gave me a much better understanding of what occurred. If you're interested in United States history, Black history, civil rights, I think that this would be a book that should be on your reading list. I thought this was really well done and a really engaging read. After that, I have The Underworld, Journeys to the Depths of the Ocean by Susan Casey. This was a book that came across my radar because of the BookTube Prize, and I'm so glad that it did. As an avid scuba diver and somebody with a rescue dive license, I am fascinated by the ocean, and particularly the depths of the ocean that I haven't been able to get to yet. Susan Casey is really well known for her books on the ocean and water and what lives below the sea. And so I was just really excited to delve into this book about the deepest parts of the world. So this book not only talks about the vibrant life that is at the very depths of the ocean, but it talks about the history of deep sea research and science. I found this all encompassing and fascinating, and I was on the edge of my seat reading this. I could not get through this book fast enough. If you, like me, are really interested in the oceans, in deep sea exploration, in marine biology, any of those topics, then this is a must-read book. I think that this was just fascinating, and I can't wait to check out more of Susan Casey's writing on the ocean. Number 15 was The Lumumba Plot, The Secret History of the CIA and a Cold War Assassination by Stuart A. Reid. Honestly, this book reads somewhat like a Cold War era spy thriller. We have the Congo, and they are seeking independence. They have a leader by the name of Lumumba who is rising in power, and we have a shady CIA intervention. Basically, in 1960, the Congo, which had been under a brutal Belgian rule, overthrew its colonial powers and reorganized to create a free Congo. Unfortunately, days after throwing off the Belgians, the Congo army that had freed the country mutinied, and the new leader, Patrice Lumumba, reached out to the United Nations in help keeping his newly formed democratic country afloat. Frustrated by the weak intervention of the United Nations, Lumumba ended up reaching out to the Soviet Union, which set off flags with the United States and the CIA. To stop the spread of communism inside of Africa, the CIA sent word to one of its agents in Africa saying that Patrice Lumumba had to go. This book chronicles that whole story. So this is another one of those books that highlighted a piece of history that I was like vaguely, just in the most peripheral manner, aware of. but had no ideas of the details. I knew a little bit about the end of Belgian colonialism in the Congo, and I knew a little bit about the Cold War, but I didn't know how these historical events crossed over. I thought that this was a fascinating read. I was not aware of Patrice Lumumba or the history of it, or that the CIA intervened in it, and I think this book just went into just excellent detail from the beginning all the way up until the assassination and then the repercussions of that assassination. This is a very complete book, and if you're interested in African history, Cold War history, the history of the Congo, the after effects of colonialism, this would be an excellent book to put on your TBR. Number 14 is Medianoche en México, El descenso de un periodista a las tinieblas de su país. For my English speakers, that's Midnight in Mexico, a reporter's journey through a country's descent into darkness, and that's written by Alfredo. Corchado. This book is about Corchado's experience reporting on many of the brutal things that are occurring in Mexico. He does not shy away from corruption, from the murders in Juarez, and from the drug cartels. But when he finds himself tangled up with Las Zetas, a paramilitary group that spun off from the Gulf Cartel, he finds himself in a little bit more trouble than he anticipated. After reporting on Las Zetas, in 2007, Corchado received a tip that his life might be in danger, and then he had to decide what to do. Stay and keep reporting or flee. This is his story of what happened. Now, if you're looking for a book that is going to discuss the history of drug cartels in Mexico or the history of drug trafficking, this isn't really that book. It does give some information, but it is not focused specifically on that subject. Really, this is a memoir of Corchado's experiences, of what he witnessed, what he wrote about, and then what happened in the fallout. I did read this book in Spanish, so I can't speak to the English translation, but I know that it was a very popular book when it first released. I think that, if you're interested in journalism, you're interested in cartels and corruption in Mexico, then this is a particularly interesting book. Number 13 was While You Were Out, an intimate family portrait of mental illness in an era of silence by Meg Kissinger. It's the 1960s in Chicago, and the Kissinger family seems like the American dream. There's 2 parents and 8 kids, and everybody seems happy and healthy to the outside world. But inside the family home, there are copious amounts of struggles with mental health. Mom is dealing with depression, dad is dealing with bipolar disorder, and several of the children are as well. 2 of the siblings end up taking their own lives. Throughout it all, the Kissinger family deals with it with a dark sense of humor, and their number 1 rule, never talk about it. In this memoir, Kissinger blows the lid off of the family secret. She talks about the struggles with mental health and how silencing it all was really detrimental in the long run. I thought this did an excellent job of thoughtfully talking about mental health and how our refusal to acknowledge or discuss mental health only exacerbates the problem. She talks about the shame that her family members often felt in admitting that there was a problem, that they were struggling, and that need to suffer in silence. And she often wonders if that didn't do more harm than good. If you particularly like memoirs and if you're interested in books on mental health, I think that this was a fantastic read and a really moving one as well. Number 12 is Brave the Wild River, the untold story of 2 women who mapped the botany of the Grand Canyon by Melissa L. Sevigny. In 1938, botanists Elsada Clover and Lois Jotter set down the Colorado River. They were accompanied by an ambitious expedition leader and 3 boatmen, and the world was waiting with bated breath. At the time, it was not believed that women could handle this type of journey. At the time, the Colorado River was famed as the most dangerous river in the world. But to Clover and Jotter, it was an unlocked mystery. The Grand Canyon held botanical secrets that nobody had yet mapped or explored. Through their diaries and letters, Sevigny creates a narrative that spans 43 days and talks about the botanical history that these 2 women made. This is a fast-paced, high-octane nonfiction book. I was so fascinated by this journey down the Colorado River. These 2 women were just unstoppable. They bucked all the social conventions and norms of the time and did something that frankly everyone thought was impossible. And they made botanical history with it. If you are interested in badass women doing badass things, if you're interested in the history of the Grand Canyon, the history of botany, or you just like a really good adventure, this is a nonfiction book that I feel should be on your TBR. This was also one of the books that I read for the BookTube Prize. And again, like you're hearing me say this over and over throughout this list, but I found so many fantastic books through judging this, and I'm really excited to check out what it brings for 2025. Number 11 is No Soy Roto, or I'm Not Broken by Jessie Leon. This is a book that was recommended to me in San Diego at Libellula Books. It is a memoir written by a San Diego native about his own experiences growing up in the 1970s. Born to indigenous working class Mexican immigrants in San Diego in the 1970s, a terrible encounter at a gift shop when he was 11 years old left Jesse with a deadly secret. Scared for his life, Jesse numbed his pain by participating in the hyper-masculine street culture that was prevalent among the area. Jesse ended up in cycles of suicide and substance abuse. But eventually, Jesse does take back control of his life and finds himself making his way to the steps of Harvard. This memoir was so emotional and heartbreaking and impactful, and as a native San Diegan, I was so proud to see how Jesse overcame the struggles that he went through. This was absolutely a book that was worth reading, and something that was both heartbreaking, emotional, and moving and inspiring. And if in particular you're interested in memoirs, if you're interested in people overcoming just inordinate obstacles, if you're interested in San Diego, any of those things, if you like emotionally moving writing, this is a memoir that I would suggest checking out. Once again, I did read this book in Spanish, but there is an English version of it that exists. I can't speak to how well the English version of it is written because I read it in Spanish, but I thought this was fantastic. And I did look at the reviews of the books in English, and many people said the same thing. So highly recommend this one. Number 10 is Beautiful Country by Qian Julie Wang. This is Wang's story of immigrating to New York when she was 7 years old. She ends up in New York City in 1994, and her parents have sacrificed everything to move from China to come here to the United States. Qian is very young and not always aware of what is going on, but what she is aware of is how much her parents have sacrificed to bring her here. Life for her is not easy as she assimilates to the United States. There are struggles with language, struggles with her parents and the jobs that they're able to get, their living conditions, and many other things. This memoir encompasses all of that. It's emotional, it's heartbreaking at times. It is at its core, though, the story of the American dream and the risks that parents take to give their children a life that they dream of. This book is beautiful and complex, and I love the way that it was written. If you like memoirs, if you're interested in immigration stories, if you're interested in the experiences of people that have to assimilate from one culture to the next, or if you're interested in what the United States is like to somebody coming from a different culture, then I think that this is a book that should be on your TBR. But honestly, I feel like this is a book that pretty much anyone should have on their TBR. It's really well written and very moving. Number 9 is We Will Be Jaguars by Nemonte Nenquimo. This was a book that I read at the end of the year in November, and I'm so glad that I did. This was a fascinating read. This is Nemonte's memoir. She is from the Guarani tribe in the Amazon region of Ecuador. And up until recently, they were one of the last remaining uncontacted tribes in the area. When she's a child, evangelicals arrive in her village and they set up shop trying to evangelize to the local tribes. Nemonte talks very clearly with her experiences of the evangelicals and their churches and the things that they're doing. And then the story moves forward to when oil companies make it into the Amazon region and start mining for oil within the Amazon River and the impacts that it has in the environment and the indigenous communities living in this area. The thing is, it's not all just here's what happened. Nemonte is inspired and she fights back, and it is about her story to find a way to stop her home from being destroyed, essentially. It also talks about her marriage, her immersion with outside society, all of the things that happened to her in just this really short span of time. This was a really interesting read. It's a perspective that I haven't actually read too many books from, and it covered just such a wide range of topics so delicately. I think that if you like memoirs, if you're interested in growing up in an indigenous tribe, especially an uncontacted one, if you're interested in the impacts of voluntourism or churches going into uncontacted areas and trying to evangelize populations, if you're interested in the environment, ecology, or the threat to the Amazon, all of those things are in this book. This is a fascinating read. Again, really interesting, really sad, really frustrating, but also a little bit hopeful at the end. So I think that this is something that should definitely be on your TBR. Number 8 is Invitation to a Banquet, the story of Chinese food by Fuschia Dunlap. Okay, so this was a book that I knew was going to be right up my alley. I am a chef for a living. I am a food nerd. I love learning about the history of food, and that is what this book is about. Dunlap talks about how Chinese food is both one of the most well-known cuisines in the world, but also the least understood. She talks about how the version of modern Chinese food that most of us are familiar with is a specific style of Cantonese cooking and is not reflective of the entirety of China. In each chapter, she talks about a different type of Chinese dish like mapo tofu or dongpo, knife-scraped noodles, braised pomelo pith, and all of these chapters and the different dishes that she talks about are representative of different aspects of Chinese cuisine. The thing that I loved about this book is it covered so much culinary history. It went into the history of banquets in China and the things that a Chinese chef would consider when putting a banquet together. Not just the flavors, but also the textures and like not utilizing the same ingredients in too many dishes. It was just beautifully interesting. I love Chinese food, what I know of it, but I also understand that I am woefully ignorant in the broad expanse of Chinese cooking. And this really illustrated so much of it for me. I couldn't get through this book fast enough. I both wanted to like rush to the end to hear all the information and slow it down so that I could savor it. Just as somebody who is a chef, I found this book incredibly fascinating. So if like me, you are really interested in the history of cuisines, how food develops, how food travels around the world, if you want to learn more specifically about China and Chinese cuisine, I highly recommend this book. I found it really approachable even if you don't have a background in food. Number 7 is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. So this is possibly one of the most well-known memoirs on this particular list. Chanel Miller was the victim of a very public sexual assault. She went to a party and then was sexually assaulted in an alleyway behind a dumpster. 2 men caught the man sexually assaulting her and held him down until police could get there. Chanel wakes up in the hospital with no memory of what's happened to her, and this thrusts her into this horrifying, tragic, enraging situation where she has to now become an advocate for herself and answer questions she should never have to answer and deal with just a broken, screwed up court system that just at the end does not really protect the victims the way that it should. Through all of this, Chanel Miller deals with this with so much poise. She writes an anonymous letter to the courts, letting them know what happened to her and like expressing her feelings as the victim of this crime, and becomes famous because her words are so poignant and so moving. And that's really how this memoir is. Everything in this memoir is just a class act. And the thing is Chanel doesn't just stop at talking about her own story, but continues to talk about advocacy and fighting. And I just thought that this was a brilliantly written memoir, going through the unimaginable and coming out the other side of it. I know that so many women relate to what Chanel has been through, sadly. And I just found it to be remarkably written. Number 6 on my list is Between Two Kingdoms by Suleika Jawoud. This is a story of chronic illness. So when Suleika is in her early 20s, she is diagnosed with cancer. And it is obviously a shock. Nobody expects to be diagnosed with cancer in her 20s. And this story chronicles her journey of dealing with cancer and her battle. It talks about her relationship with her partner at the time and how they dealt with this journey together and the toll it took on their relationship. And then as Suleika comes out the other side of the cancer journey, it talks about what's next and being stuck between two kingdoms, between the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the ill, and not knowing how to transition out of being chronically ill. This is a longer memoir, and I know that some people have commented on it being a little bit overlong, but for me, having dealt with chronic illness, I really related to this book. Mine and Suleika's journeys are completely different. I have not had cancer, but I have had endometriosis, and that tends to spread throughout your body in a similar way. There's no cure for it. There's only surgery to try to fix some of the damage, and sometimes you can use birth control to try to suppress the symptoms, although it doesn't stop the growth. While I won't die from mine, I do have that experience of feeling like my body is betraying me, and the chronic pain, the frustration, the rage, the anger, the inability to do the things that I want to sometimes, and some of the other impacts that Suleika talks about within her book. This was a book that I read at the height of my struggles with endometriosis, actually right before I went in for a hysterectomy. And it was just something that really hit me hard in the heart. If you're interested in memoirs about overcoming struggles, about cancer and chronic illness. If you are the family member of somebody that's dealing with chronic illness, I feel like this would be a particularly impactful read. It's sometimes hard to understand what people are going through when they are dealing with a chronic condition, especially a life-threatening one. And so I think that this book could provide a lot of insight into that. I found this particularly poignant. Like I said, that this hit me at just the right moment in my life, at a time when I really, really needed to feel a lot less alone than I was feeling at the time. And so I feel like it's got an emotional impact that not everyone will necessarily feel, but I do think it's just an incredibly moving memoir and definitely worth the read. Number 5 on my list is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a memoir that receives so much praise, and deservedly so. This is Machado's experiences in an abusive same-sex relationship. One of the things that I found really interesting was in either the foreword or the prologue to the book, Machado talks about her experiences in this abusive relationship and how after coming out of it, she looked for books about this particular topic and could not find any memoirs about it. And so she ended up writing her own. This is a very literary memoir. It's broken into little vignettes, and each little vignette is titled In the Dream House something. I found the vignettes very moving, very impactful. This is a very quick read because each vignette is only like a half a page to usually 2 pages long, so it feels like it moves really rapidly. But Machado writes in brilliant prose. This almost reads like a poem, except it's like this nightmarish poem where you see this relationship going wrong, you see the red flags popping up, and you know what's going to happen, but you can't look away. I think that this was brilliantly written. It deserves all the hype that it gets. I think Machado was very brave in sharing her struggles with this abusive relationship, and I'm sure that this book has been solace to a lot of people that have experienced similar situations. If you like prosy style writing, if you like vignettes, if you like books about relationships, especially conflicted relationships or abusive relationships, if you like, again, people overcoming adversity, if you just want to read something that's beautifully written, I would highly recommend this memoir. Number 4 is The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the Present by Dr. David Treuer. This is a book that gives us Native American history from 1890 all the way until the present. So often when we think about Native American history, we think of Wounded Knee. That's like a cultural point that a lot of people refer to, but there's so much more to Native history than just that specific incident. Dr. David Treuer goes into great detail explaining what happened leading up to it, what happened after it, and what has happened to Indigenous cultures in the United States since. This book went into so many different directions and so many different cultural aspects. It covered parts of history that I was unfamiliar with. This was just a wonderful resource for learning more about Indigenous history in the United States. This even goes into land grabs and political maneuvering in modern times. It goes into the perception of Native Americans currently. It talks about how in terms of like modern cultural icons, most people can't name anyone besides Jim Thorpe of Indigenous identity. This was just a brilliantly written book. If you are interested in the history of the United States, if you're interested in Native American and Indigenous cultures, if you're interested in politics, geography, anything, this book is really a great read. It's a wealth of knowledge, and I feel like honestly it should be something that's added to like the high school curriculum for history. Number 3 on my list is Tías and Primas, On Knowing and Loving the Women Who Raise Us by Prisca, Dorcas, Mojica, Rodriguez. This was a really interesting book. It was one that came across my radar because of Seal Press. I am a Seal Press ambassador, and so every season they send me a list of books that they're going to be publishing for that like 3-month period, and I have the opportunity to request ARC. This was a book that I was immediately interested in. I have read Rodriguez's writing previously and found her to be a very compelling author. In this particular book, the subject matter really spoke to me. This goes into the stereotypes of the different women and the roles they play within families. It talks about how, you know, you have the tia loca, or the crazy aunt, who, you know, everybody's like, oh, don't do what she does, she's kind of crazy because she's eccentric or she's different. It talks about the pretty prima, or the pretty cousin, who is like put on a pedestal for her looks and her features. It talks about the matriarch, who is the core of the community and the family and holds everyone together. Basically, each chapter author goes into a different role or stereotype and talks about why this stereotype exists and like how it developed and what that person is actually like and what you can really count on them for. I thought that this spoke to womanhood beautifully. I don't have a large family, but even in my small family, I've seen some of these stereotypes, and definitely in my friends and their families around me, I've seen these stereotypes as well. Though Rodriguez is from Nicaragua, I think that any woman from any cultural background would relate to a lot of what she has written about within this book. I certainly did. There were things in particular that really hit home for me, ways that I felt stereotyped as a young person, and I just thought this was an incredibly well written book. And now into my last two, the two best nonfiction books that I read in 2024. Number 2 is The Way That Leads Among the Lost: Life, Death, and Hope in Mexico City's Anexos. This is written by Angela Garcia. This was a book that I came across due to NetGalley. I was kind of scanning through some of the audiobooks that were available, and I came across this one. I have traveled pretty extensively through Mexico. I've been to 13 states on various trips, and this was something I'd never heard of. I was like, what's an anexo? I was not prepared for what this book was about. So I opened up the summary and read it and was like, oh, this sounds like an incredibly interesting topic, one that I have never read anything about or heard anything about prior. So what an anexo is an informal treatment center for drug or alcohol addiction. And they've popped up all around Mexico City. And basically, what happens is if in a family you have somebody that is struggling with substance abuse, people get desperate and they hire an anexo to essentially come in and kidnap the family member, force them into this informal treatment center, and then hold them hostage until they've gone through withdrawal and treatment and are cured. The success rates are questionable. Some people make it through and recover, and some people go back to what they were doing before. Sometimes these anexos are run by people who are former addicts themselves and have experience with the 12-step process or the recovery process, and they mirror those techniques in what they've done with their anexo. But other times they're business people looking to take advantage of desperate people, and they use very questionable tactics. Some of them rely on humiliation and breaking someone down to try to get them out of addiction. But at the end of the day, due to the lack of facilities with doctors and physicians to deal with addiction and substance abuse, many families end up relying on these anexos. This book was fascinating. It was heartbreaking, it was sad, it was a lot of things, but it was something that I literally had no idea about. Garcia spent a decade researching this topic in Mexico City, and this is said to be the first book that has ever talked about anexos. It took a long time for her to build trust with the owners of the different anexos and the people who have been subjugated to them, but it shows within the work. This is detailed, it's rich, and it even talks about the spread of anexos into the United States. If you're interested in the topics of substance abuse intervention, anthropology, how drug trafficking has affected the population of Mexico City itself, this is a fascinating read. I would honestly recommend this book to anyone as long as you're not sensitive or triggered by the topic of substance abuse. I thought this was just fantastically researched and written, and it shows in every single page. And my favorite nonfiction book of 2024. So I'm going to preface this by saying it's hard to say that this was my favorite read, because this was brutal and heartbreaking and sad and left me wanting to throw this book across the room. This is not an easy read, but I do think that this was the most emotionally impactful and moving book that I read in 2024, whether that be nonfiction or fiction. It's a book that still haunts me, even though it's been months and months since I've read it. And it's one that I think most people should read. That book is We Were Once a Family, a story of love, death, and child removal in America by Roxana Asghari. March 26, 2018, rescue workers found a crumpled SUV at the bottom of the cliffs off of the Pacific Coast Highway. What they would find there would shock the country. There were 2 women and 6 children dead in the wreck, and it turned out to be a murder-suicide. Jennifer and Sarah Hart were a married white couple who adopted 6 Black children from Texas's foster care system in 2006 and 2008. They put on the facade of a happy, loving family to their adoptive children, but behind that facade was abuse and neglect. In the investigation, it became really clear that Texas knew very little about the women who they adopted all of these 6 children out to, and there was a little follow-up with claims of abuse and neglect. Though the children tried to report their conditions to teachers and neighbors, they were always returned to this family and punished for speaking out. This book talks about this case specifically and interrogates what happened, but it is a larger conversation about how foster care fails families on a day-to-day basis, but how in particular it fails Black families. This case is horrifying. This is something I remember reading about when it happened and being like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. How did this happen? But I had no idea how negligent the Texas courts were in the handling of this case. In one of the cases, there were family members who were willing to take these children. And in the other family's case, they were still fighting for custody and their court case had not been resolved. And the Texas court system went ahead and adopted these children out irregardless. There was absolutely a clear pattern of racism and discrimination against these families, and it resulted in the death of these 6 beautiful children. This is a horrifying, maddening, angering, frustrating read. Again, like I said, I wanted to throw my book across the room as I finished reading it. One of my best friends growing up grew up in foster care, and I already knew that foster care was a very broken system. I saw the homes that she got put in. I saw the overburdened foster care workers that were trying to manage too many cases with too little budget, and many of them were too burned out. I saw the families that took children in just to receive the paychecks, and I didn't have the greatest impression of this particular system to begin with, and that's in California. But reading about this situation in Texas and how these families were treated and how this isn't even that uncommon and how these kids ended up with this family in this horrible situation is just horrifying, and there's no other words for it. This is an incredibly well-researched, well thought out, and well-written book. I would recommend it to everyone, especially here in the United States. I think that this is something that more people need to read and understand. This is a broken system, one that absolutely has to be fixed for the sake of the many, many families that are stuck dealing with this shit. But go into it knowing that this is going to be a horribly hard book to read. There is the discussion of suicide and murder, the discussion of racism, a lot of really problematic content within the court and the police and all of that. So be prepared for that if you do pick this up. But if you feel like you're in a place to handle all of that, this book is one that should be read. Brilliantly researched and brilliantly written, heartbreaking, moving, something that will definitely stick with you. And this is another book that came across my radar because of the BookTube prize. This was my vote for winning the round that I voted in with this particular book. I thought this was phenomenally written, and I hope more of you will read it. So that is the end of my list. As you can see, I had a lot of really good, interesting nonfiction reads in 2024. I was so excited about the variety of topics and the breadth of the things that they covered. I also just want to say that many of the books on this list are very emotionally impactful and deal with very difficult subjects. So if you do decide to read any of them, please make sure you check the trigger warnings beforehand so you know what you're getting yourself into. That being said, I hope that this added some things to your TBR. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up, comment down below, and let me know, did you read any amazing nonfiction in 2024? What were your best and worst books? Are you interested in reading any of the ones that I've mentioned here, or have you read them? How did you feel about them? And if you're not already subscribed to my channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.